Okay. Hi, I'm Aurora Harris, and I am 66 years old, and I was born in Detroit, Michigan.
How did you first come into poetry and what drew you specifically to the Detroit poetry scene?
I came into poetry when I was 6 or 7 years old. Um, in 1967, before the Detroit Rebellion happened, um, my mom and my siblings and I were traveling to the Philippines. I'm African American Filipina, and we stopped in Japan, in Tokyo, on the way to the Philippines. And my mom took us shopping on the Ginza. Now, to give you a little bit of background about my mom was a survivor of World War II during the Japanese invasion, so she spoke fluent Japanese at the time. So when we were shopping, we stopped in a shop on the Ginza, and there were some poetry books. She was buying some souvenirs. She bought a Japanese haiku book of poetry, and then she taught me how to write my first haiku in the Tokyo Hilton. And then after that, I wasn't involved in the poetry. I journaled most of my life. I didn't get really back into poetry until 1993. And that's when I started writing full time.
Do you remember the first poem you've ever shared out loud? Where was it and what inspired it?
I think the first poem that I shared out loud was the one that the series of haiku that I wrote in 1967. It was 3 haiku, and it dealt with my observations as a child of how people looked at us here in Detroit because my mother was a white-skinned Filipina and married, to a black man, and we're brown children, right? So, we were subjected to a lot of finger pointing and all this other stuff, and then so those were the memories that I had of how people, in society looked at other people, and we have been victims of racism here. So, I was very much aware of how people looked at other people who they considered foreigners, whether we were mixed race or whatever, how they looked at my mother as a white woman when she wasn't. And at that time, there was still a lot of social, resistance to people that of mixed marriages, right? But, because I spoke 3 different languages at the time. My mother would speak to my siblings and I in our Tagalog language, and we would respond, and everybody would say, oh, they're not from here. And then they would kind of ease up, right? So, that was one of the poems that I read. Another one was a poem that I wrote called Twilight and Cass. And I was out on the streets looking for a relative of mine who had got caught up in the streets. And it documented the activities on Cass Avenue before all the gentrification came in. And I remember that as being a significant poem because I went to Ann Arbor to read it. I think this is like 1993, 1994. And there were sociologists and architects from U of M, University of Michigan, at that reading. And when I came off the stage, they came up to me and they said, oh, could you come to this conference and read this poem because we're redesigning that whole area. And I didn't respond back to them. I was like, oh, really? Well, good luck, And then I over the years, I watched how it changed. So that was my first, experience of hint from a university, having involvement in Detroit and the changes that would come. And, it is what it is now. And I work for U of M. I teach at U of M now. So.
Wow, that's an interesting story. Not even on the page, but I'm wondering, why do you think they wanted you to read that poem? Yeah, I have my thoughts, but I'm just wondering, like, initially, what did you think about that?
Well, initially, the premise of the poem was that when I came out in public to write, I looked at my poems as snapshots of society, and they were related to Emile Durkheim, concept of anomie, and and the concept of suicide. And I was dealing with these types of things, looking at how society and the people around me were committing various forms of suicide, whether it be through, drugs, alcoholism, whatever. And at that time, too, I was also interested in how the auto industry, when it pulled out, here we have, auto workers that created middle class. And then all of a sudden, people who had lived their whole entire lives, in the factories or Dodge, Maine or whatever, Fleetwood auto factory and other places, they spent their whole lives there, and then all of a sudden things started shutting down and moving to the suburbs. And of course, this created, and I could go into so much history regarding the auto industry, but it was like how, many people were alcoholics, and people who had saved and bought their homes and things like that were starting to lose their homes, okay? So when in answer to your question, how I related, or the reasons why they even wanted me to read the poem, was for me to validate the things that were happening along Cass Avenue with the prostitution, with the drug addiction, with the people who were homeless or unhoused, with the poverty, And not too long after that, that's when they came in, and all of the rents went up in the Wayne State area. And then they started the renaming of the districts.
Do you believe there's something a little bit skewed about that, simply because it doesn't tell the full story, or maybe like they used your poem, or you didn't go?
Well, I didn't go.
Right.
They didn't use my poem.
They could have, and then
They could have,
Then it would have been like, yeah, see?
Right, no, but yeah, because I document social issues, political issues, global issues in my writing that deal with, Detroit, from Detroit to wherever in the world. And I document human condition, women's conditions, children's, whatever. So I understand and understood at that time the broader ways and how my poetry could be used, which is why, for a long time, I didn't come out and read my work. And much of my work, once people heard it in the early days, would request my work for publication. And then after a while, I think by the time of the World Trade Organization protests in Seattle in the early 2000s, and then you had the Chiapas uprisings in Mexico and things like that, I was writing about that kind of stuff. And I was very much aware of the possibility that if I read my 2 political poems out, that I could be censored, or if I traveled to a certain country, I could end up disappeared and things like that. So I've been, even though I'm an activist, poet, educator, I'm very, very aware of many things that could affect me personally. At the time, my parents were alive, and the rest of my family.
Thank you for that. I outside of poetry, what kind of work were you doing at the time you entered the scene?
Well, I was working for a telecommunications company for about 10 years, and I left in 1993 because I was injured. I had carpal tunnel syndrome up to my neck. I couldn't really use my hands or my arms or anything. And I moved home and I started taking care of my nephew, my great nephew, who has autism, and was caretaking my parents. So the first, year or so, that's when I was trying to figure out whether or not my writing even fit into contemporary poetry in the United States and abroad and all this other stuff. And I decided to go out and just check out, what was there. But I was reading a lot of different poets, and I was looking for voices such as my own, you know, Afro-Asian writing, or, whatever, however you want to label it. And I didn't find too much at the time. So I just started recording what came into my head because I couldn't write. And then from those recordings and notes and things that my mother had kept over the years, I began piecing things together.
You already spoke to this a little bit, but anything you want to add? What was Detroit like socially, politically, or culturally when you first joined the poetry scene?
When I first started going out into the coffee houses, there were so many different venues. There was a venue every week, it seemed like. You couldn't go any, like 2, 3 square miles in Detroit without finding a poetry venue somewhere. And it led to my making my own series. It was called World Voice Cultural Arts. And I started at the old Billiard Gallery, which used to be the office for the Detroit Cultural Arts Office, I think it was. But there was Pour Me Cafe, Mahogany. There were so many different places. The library with the Writer's Voice. Broadside Press was having their poets workshops. Ron Allen had the Horizons in Poetry series going. M.L. Liebler did the Writer's Voice series that ran out of libraries and stuff. But there was a lot of independent, Black-owned coffee houses or places that you could go. And I used to talk to those folks and tell them, or ask them, do you own this building? I would encourage people, this leasing situation is not good. If by any way means necessary, get with some people and see if you can buy that space, because I don't think, many of the Black-owned coffee shops lasted 5 years, from the east side to the one that was on Woodward. The Meadery Eatery was one of them that we did slam in later. But they would raise the rents, they would raise the leases. And then people that's how in my opinion, that's how the coffee shops and things started closing down, all the poetry venues. Politically, everybody was, pretty politically aware and socially aware of things that were going on. And there were so many different types of voices and so many different types of venues in poetry. And in 1993, that's when I first got into the Poetry Slam. I didn't know what it was. And I ended up on the first Detroit team that went to the slams in Ann Arbor.
What was the name of the team, do you remember?
I think it was called the Detroit Hamtramck team or something like that.
Yeah, so pivoting into what you're already talking about, spaces, venues, and events. what do you remember about the poetry spaces you came up in? Where were they and what did they feel like? Anything you want to add?
Yeah, well, when I first came out, some of the places were really welcoming, others were not. I mean, there was this whole air of, whatever you want to, arrogance, I'll call it. And I remember being the first one there. My dad would drive me around to different places, and I would be the first one there and sign up, and then all these other people would come later, and then they would call all these people out of order, and I would be, I'd sit there and say, hey, I was here first. I've been sitting here for 2 hours. What is this? And they would shove pieces of paper in my face and say, oh, do you come to this reading? I mean, I was very taken aback by it. And it was because I was an older, at that time, I was in my 30s when I came out full time. So I wasn't used to this type of thing, and that's when, at one point, I think in 94, I went to California, and I was discovered in California. And I went to a poetry reading in South LA, and I liked the way that they ran their poetry venues there. You had like your workshop poets that would come up and read, and then you get feedback and critique, and then you'd have a featured reader, and then you have open mic. So that's where I got the concept on how I wanted to run my own poetry series. And then, that's how World Voice came about.
It's still happening to this day. I mean, like, oh, now I'm coming back to this one because I definitely signed my name and I'm going never.
Right. It needs, folk need to just be kind and respectful.
Do you remember any of the names? I know you mentioned some. Any of the names of the venues or spaces that you frequented?
I don't think I frequented any of them. I may have stopped in them maybe once or twice or something like that. And then, after I met Ron Allen, after the first, okay, so it's like there was bars, right? When I first came out and got involved with slam, they were held in bars, and then they were held in coffee houses. And I remember going to Lily's Bar in Hamtramck because I saw an ad in the paper that they were looking for spoken word artists to do this thing called slam. And if you won, you got to go to the Lollapalooza in Pine Knob, and then you would slam against the New Eurekan poets and some other folks. So I went to that, and I ended up being one of the people that won. And then later on, I was asked, could you come over to this coffee shop that was on, I think it was Second, next to the Bronx Bar at the time, to be a judge for this other poetry slam. And then after that, everyone went to the Cass Cafe because that Ron Allen had his hip series running out of there. And that's when I met Ron Allen. And then we had a talk, and then I was booked on his series. But from the people who actually got a chance to hear me in any of the coffee shops, those people were the ones who were contacting me later. Like, I read a piece, a women's piece, and then someone from U of M Women's Studies contacted me. So that piece was one of the first publications that I had. And then there was another group, M.L. Liebler, and I can't remember the man from Ohio, but they published an anthology of Detroit writers. So that was my first group of poems that went into that anthology.
Okay, yeah, I think Nandi told me about this anthology.
Yeah, it was called Brooding the Heartlands.
What was I gonna ask? So Ron Allen brought you into Cass Cafe, his series there.
Yeah.
And do you remember the name of the anthology? Not the anthology, the article you mentioned that you were published by the Women's Studies?
I don't remember because it was so long ago. But if you go to University of Michigan Women's Studies Archive and look up their journal, that those poems are online now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Definitely wanna look that up. Besides open mics, what other ways do people share or capture poetry back then?
Well, because there were so many different coffee houses, and we were a writerly group. I mean, we met in coffee houses to write. I remember going every week to a different coffee house or a particular coffee house in Hamtramck or in downtown. And we would just sit there and write all day, and no one would bother us. So it was such a weird scenario, right? You will go in on a Saturday around 10 o'clock, and the whole room would be full of writers, and no one would say a word. We get our coffee, the person would not even bother us. And then around noon, we'd all take a break and go outside and walk and shake it off. And then we come back and ask, well, what do you think about these lines? What do you think about these images? Here's my piece. Where do you think I should break these lines? Or does this beginning match up with the end? So we had actual conversations about what we were writing and how we could improve it. So I really missed that part of, what was happening back then, because that's not happening too much now, you know. And then when Broadside Press Poets Theater, they were in the building down on Lafayette in one underneath the lofts down there. I went there, and that's when I got to see poets that workshop, and then they got to read. But outside of that and what was happening in individual coffee houses with the writers, I mean, a lot of us, we didn't even know each other by name, and it was just so weird, The coffee person would come over and we would be like in the middle, because we didn't want to break that train of thought. That's how, how we were writing back then.
Mm-hmm. Would you call this group of people academics? Like were they in college and school?
We were a mix of people. There were people of different ages. They weren't what we call academics, but most of us were, had gone to college and had studied. Some of us, like I myself, I didn't take any writing classes. I taught myself through reading hundreds of books and looking for voices like my own. So we were from all different types of backgrounds. There were some visual artists, painters that were writing. There were musicians that were writing. There were teens that were writing,
Okay. Are there significant markers or moments or turning points in the Detroit poetry scene worth mentioning?
Turning points, yes. One of the turning points was that after being involved with slam for so many years, I was a coach. I went from being one of the slam poets into becoming one of the coaches with Ella Singer and Scott Klein out of Hamtramck and other folk. We tried very hard to win the slams because it's a national, international venue, right? And we were traveling from state to state and whatever. And one of the turning points that I clearly remember was the poet Blair. I was teaching slam workshops out of the Adamantine Library at Wayne State, and Blair came. And he brought his poem Behind the Garage and a recording of an opera, an Italian opera. And he said, Ro, listen to this. And I listened to it and I broke down crying. And I was like, this is gonna win. This is gonna win. And so when they went to the slam that year, that was the year that they won because of that poem. And then after that, I'm into techno. I'm a former DJ, so I followed the techno movement festivals, and Derek May was the ex-partner of a friend of mine, Laura Gavor, who put all the techno people on the map. We went to college together, and we were DJs in college, right? So I noticed that they were bringing in all of these spoken word artists from other states. And I called Derek. I went to see him. I was like, look, we just won the slam. You got to put us on. So that was one of the turning points. We had the first slam team at the Movement Festival. So people got to hear Detroiters for the first time en masse, worldwide, people with that type of audience. Let's see, another.
And y'all were spitting poetry at Movement?
Yeah.
With music in the back or just?
No, they put us on, we got a stage and we went up there and we did our thing.
Wow.
So, I'm connected to a lot of things in Detroit. So, if I need to do something, you know what I mean? I pick up, I tell folks all the time, don't let me pick up my phone, right? And another turning point was that when they built the Max Fisher Theater, they were just building it. Ella Singer and myself were two of the first slam poets that contacted the Max Fisher and said, you need to have poetry here. So we were in there with hard hats on, talking to folks as they were building it. And we had a group called Convergence. It was me, Ella, and another dancer. She was Indian dancer, Sananda Samadar. We had formed a women's performance group. So we were called Convergence, and we were the first poetry performance with dance in that space, to open that space. And then later on, Kalima Hassan, who was, on the slam team, got involved. And then the slam was now part of the symphony at Meadowbrook. So that was a big turning point there, because and then when I got involved with Frida Sampson, she ran the Java Coffee House on Lothrop. And I ran my poetry series out of her place. I had workshops there. And she was the first African-American woman that had a coffee shop that expanded. So she went from Lothrop to Wayne State. She had a coffee shop in Adamantly. She had a coffee shop downstairs in the Student Center building. And then she opened the first coffee shop in the main library. So when Frida did that, and I was doing the poetry, that's how the Comerica Java Jazz series got started. We started that. And many people don't know that. So I was the first person to book all the poets and the bands for that first year, that first series.
Comerica Java Jazz?
Comerica Java Jazz. I think we started that in 2000 or 2001, it's still going. So when we talk about turning points, what I am mostly concerned with is building longevity and legacy, right? Because many of us here are very talented. We're gifted, I believe. That's my opinion, right? Detroit's the hub of, so many different geniuses. And we're not often looked at or recognized. So when you go out and you start building things, you want to be able to have something that's going to last, that's going to serve the public, that's going to be part of the history of things that have been happening here. Another turning point, and I think this will be the last one I'll talk about, was when I got with Ron Allen, and we started up Saturday night Central at Central United Methodist Church. And that was an alternative worship service that ran on Saturday evenings for the shut-in and the elders that lived around downtown and, kids in group homes or whatever. And we had a very eclectic mix of having scripture, and I would get the scripture from the pastor or the reverend, and then I would turn that into poetry for the people. And then the jazz musicians would come in and they would do their interpretation of the scripture. And then sometimes we would have artists. So it would be like the sermon, then the poetry, the jazz people. Sometimes we had a visual artist painting according to the scriptures. I remember I did a poem one time, and the Detroit Windsor Dance Company or something like that was housed in the building downtown. They came in and did interpretive dance in the sanctuary. So, that type of, appeal to everybody, that lasted, I think, about 3 or 4 years.
So you would meet with the pastor beforehand? So
Yes. Yeah, we met with the pastor every week. Or he would call me and say, hey, Aurora, this is the scripture for this week. Look this up, blah, blah, blah. And I read it, and then I start writing.
That is amazing.
So, it's like I did turns on stuff like, let's see, when Jesus was in the hole and the rock and the angel came and the women. So I turned it so that the women were the first apostles to bring the news, because they were the ones who were attending, right? So, that kind of stuff, I do a lot of research on those types of things, who was involved and what their role was, to give it a different kind of a spin.
Wow. Okay. Oh, yeah, okay. So this next portion is about influences and collaborations. You mentioned some names already, but anything you want to add? Who were the voices that shaped you or inspired the scene when you started locally or nationally?
When I was a child, I was familiar with broadside press poets. So I would say Dudley Randall, because he was one, he started the press in 1965, so I was a child then. And people, different spaces I was in at the time, you could find his poems. Later on, I would say, when I came out as a full-time writer, I remember being at the Detroit Arts Festival, and Sonia Sanchez came. And she had her first manuscript. It had not even been published yet. It was called Does Your House Have Lions? And it was a poetry about her brother who was dying from AIDS. I was in the audience, and I had a good friend that was dying from AIDS. So when I heard Sonia read, I turned to my friends and I said, I write like her. And then I told them that one day I'm going to be on the stage. The next year on my birthday, I was on that stage at the Arts Festival. But this time I was reading with Filipino writers. So it was like Sonia Sanchez influenced me. Then I got to read with Jessica Hagedorn. She was a Filipino writer out of San Francisco at the time. And then later on, I performed with Jane Cortez. Because I liked the way that she had the bands and the music and stuff going. Amiri Baraka, Etheridge Knight, Gwendolyn Brooks, all the classic people, gave me the confidence to write about not only African American life, but Filipino life too, or Asian, whatever, you know. And I always had that, like I said, from traveling as a kid, that broad perspective and different type of the way in which I looked at the world and the people in it, because I have been exposed to so many different things.
Were there any international, city, or statewide collaborations or travels you were a part of or remember happening? I know you mentioned the state-to-state travel, but anything else you might add?
I remember when I first started doing slam, I went to Toronto and I qualified. I was the first poet to qualify for the Toronto and the Detroit team. And I had to make a decision, but I stuck with Detroit, you know, because that's where I'm from. But I did some collaborations with, let's see, the first Concert of Colors. That was not the Concert of Colors when it first came out. Ishmael Ahmed, who is responsible for the Concert of Colors, had the first run of it, and it was called like the World something, cultural something. And I remember one of my first bookings was with the Last Poets. So I didn't like collaborate with them. But when I went to the Lollapalooza, when I was talking about that earlier, and I did my poem, I got booed off the stage in that slam. But I was reading this poem about Malice Green, and I didn't let that crowd stop me, because there was a line in it. That's the line of poem says somebody painted a swastika on Malice Green's face, somebody painted hate words on the wall or something like that. And all these like people were just booing me and they couldn't score me. But I just kept going. And so when I got done, I turned around, here were these black men standing behind me. And I turned and they said, "Hey, sister, that was real strong, blah, blah, blah." I said, "Thank you." And they said, "Yeah, you just kept going. You know, that was really good." And I said, "Thank you. Who are you?" And they said, "We are the Last Poets." So that's how I met the Last Poets. And then later on, I ended up on stage with them at that first, concert of colors with them, and then with Marion Hayden. So over the years, I've done collaborations with Marion Hayden with jazz and poetry and things like that. And at one point, I gave some advice to the Last Poets, because they came here to do a concert or poetry reading, and the venue didn't want to pay them. Right. So, and that's another thing, is part of, me being out here and creating and promoting poetry or jazz artists or whatever, musician, whatever. If I'm helping you, I'm gonna do the best I can to negotiate the best price for your art, the best payment, because we're so undervalued on so many different levels. And the Last Poets, come on. You know what I mean? You don't want to pay the Last Poets what they're worth. You don't want to pay Marion Hayden and Straight Ahead what they're worth. You don't want, you know what I'm saying? So behind the scenes, excuse me, it's those types of collaborations, and from an artistic and a musician and a writerly point of view, but then there's also the business side of it. And I got the business side from my parents, because we had independent businesses before. And I used to work with a bunch of attorneys when I was in the corporate world. So so those type of collaborations, going out and doing workshops in libraries. I was a poet in resident for a long time with Broadside Press. teaching in the summers in different libraries. Other collaboration, working in museums. I would do workshops in museums. Another type of collaboration was working in the Wayne County Juvenile Center on the Boys and Girls Unit. Ellen and I used to teach poetry and art therapy, so being in coffee houses, collaborating in coffee houses, museums, social agencies, and things like that. I did some work with Alternative for Girls when they first started, and that, as an educator and a poet, one of the things that I try to do is plant seeds of hope. Poetry is to plant seeds of hope. And it was really eye-opening when I was working out of the church with the Alternative for Girls, because it's my first time teaching a group of young women, or at this point they would be called they, who were in gangs, and they had a lot of trauma. So, to understand the whole world of LGBT early on through those teens, and then later going on into one of the holding centers for girls, led to a turning point of how I affected people, because I ran into one of those teens years later. And she was of Hispanic descent. She was talking to her people in Spanish, and she told them that I saved her life because I taught her how to process all the stuff she was doing in poetry.
To kind of backtrack a little bit, I'm curious about the prices, or the fees, or the quotes, or what was the price like around that time? What were people charging for the work that they did as a poet, or even the open mic?
Well, the thing was that let's start. When I started my series, and everyone else was doing their series, they would either pay us through grants or pay us off the door, whatever was collected. Some folks would not pay, or they could pay whatever they could afford at the time, right? Whatever the venue could afford. But for seasoned writers who had publications and things like that, or they had been traveled or whatever, it was kind of strange to be asked to come and read for $25. Okay? So the range could be anywhere from 25, 50, sometimes 100, sometimes 250 on up, depending on how you've been out there, how long you've been out there, and what your street cred or your publication cred is.
So this next question is about the evolution of the scene and language around that. How has the scene evolved, poetry scene, evolved since you became involved? What has changed? What has stayed the same? How have you changed?
I think that there are not enough venues. There's only a few venues from what I've seen, because I have not been on the scene in a long time, many years. But because I've been a judge for the Motown Mike poetry series, spoken word, for about 8, 9 years, some of those poets started up their own venues. So I know of a couple of people that are still running like spoken word, even though the Poetry Slam National is no longer in operation. There's still, poetry slams and spoken word competitions going. It's just not as many as there were before. Um, the way that I've changed is that I don't have enough time to write like I used to. Because when I first came out as a full-time poet, after I left the corporate world, I sued the company. So that money allowed me to write full-time for 10 years every day. And that's what I was used to doing before I started working and teaching full-time at the university. So at this point, it's, balancing workload, trying to carve out time to write and, finish up whatever manuscripts I've been trying to get out. And I'm still taking care of my nephew. And today's his birthday, so he's a grown man. But, he still has needs, you know what I mean? So that's one way that I've changed. Now, in terms of the writing, I'm still writing political poems. I'm still writing so-called nice poems. Why is everything so long? Why is everything so political? Because I have a lot to say, But I try to, get it down to a couple of stanzas or a page now. I'm not performing with bands as much as I used to, but I still find some time to write. I just won a chapbook contest, came up runner-up. I was notified last month, but I can't say anything about it right now because they haven't done the media
See, I was
on
about
it.
to be like, what?
But you guys will hear about it soon.
Okay, that's pretty cool.
Yeah. So another turning point that just came to mind was the building that we're in right now doing this interview. There was a coffee shop and poetry reading here called Manila Bay, and it was run by a fellow Filipino. And so this was like the first place that was run by a Filipino coffee shop and poetry reading. And I remember reading here up front.
And I was called the Love Building
Yes.
on Grand Boulevard. Okay, so this next question is about challenges in community health. How have you experienced or witnessed any challenges or harm in the poetry community? How have you or others navigated that?
I haven't witnessed any harm in the poetry community, but I have witnessed and have had workshops with many people who like to write poetry, who had experienced some type of trauma.
Individually or within the poetry scene?
Just basically individually. I have not heard of any type of violence or anything like that in the poetry world or the poetry scene.
Okay. So these next two questions, something that I'll probably circle back around, but just to note, do you have any photos, flyers, newspaper clippings, articles, books, or video footage you'll be willing to share for the archive?
I have a few things that are online that you can go on and look at that are some clips of me in different places and spaces. I'm currently archiving my house with all the stuff that I have in it. But I do have maybe some early flyers of Slam. I think I still have some copies of the chapbooks that the Slam teams made, because that was how we funded our travel and meal expenses or hotel expenses. We got into our own self-publication for the Slam poets to get us around. So.
Okay. Maybe I can scan some of those.
I have some recordings, poetry recordings on YouTube.
Okay, nice. Yeah, I'm gonna need those links. Or know where to look. The next question is, do you have a poem about Detroit, the scene, or your experience in it that you would like to share or have remembered? You don't need to do it now unless you would like to, but
That one, Twilight and Cass from early on. The other one is called War is Here. That's the recorded with the In the Tradition jazz band. But I'll try to do it. The Twilight and Cass. On the corner of Twilight and Cass, the shadows are creeping along, while feathers are rustling in their nests to prepare for the morning song. The alley sings loudly, bangs and clangs. The stray dogs are in search of food. Underneath a pup's whimpering noise, a trash can feeds a person too. Along the way, a bottle is thrown. Street lights reflect from the slivers. I see a shell on a curbside bed. Palms wait for bus stop giver. Abandoned building is not alone. The name faded from weathered sign is seen in a flash and a flicker from huddled and twitching cracked minds. As the sun comes up, the belle de jour come out with their sleepy eyes. They'll leave with that man and part their legs. Money quiets the hungry cries of the waking children.
wow, powerful, right?
Thank you. So that's the piece that, they wanted me to do at that conference, the pre-gentrification conference.
Wow, that is truly a marker right there. Mm. Um, what do you feel are the positive contributions of the Detroit poetry scene to the city of Detroit and its people?
We have many contributions. I mean, we have had, poet laureates. We've had people recognized by Kresge Foundation as eminent artists. We've had poetry slam winners. We've had people who are published now. The presses are still going, like Broadside Press, Aquarius Press, Willow Books. We have the zine production that's going. So we have always continued the legacy of poetry, art, and print culture that started back in the 60s when I was a child. So that contribution is major. I consider major because we're still producing. Nothing has ever stopped us. The rebellion didn't stop us. The changes in politics and government didn't stop us. Poverty didn't stop us. The water shut off didn't stop us. The incinerator that was polluting the neighborhoods didn't stop us. The gas crisis that stopped all the Michigan farmers from coming to the Eastern market to sell didn't stop us. The fake bankruptcy of the city didn't stop us. Having, no water, no heat, high prices, high taxes, destruction of schools didn't stop us. So, there's always been someone. It didn't matter what age they were, middle school, high school, elementary, university, seasoned or not, academic or not, we've always been producing. And the thing is that we, as artifacts, the writing, as far as I'm concerned, is that they're teaching tools. So long after we're gone, whomever published, whoever put something out, they're being archived in the universities, they're being archived at the libraries, they're archived on YouTube, or they're archived on different, Spotify, whatever it is, right? So that stuff will always be there, And then this project too is very important because you're archiving the generations, and I'm like second generation. That's what I consider myself in terms of activism and as writing, right? So to be able to collect and preserve that history is very, very important. Because see, with the times that we're in now, with everything being erased, and we could barely teach about various cultures or any culture right now. To have that type of access for people to go in and be able to pull it up, on the internet or go and see it somewhere exhibited is really important as part of the cultural production of the poets and the writers and people here.
I agree 100%. Four more questions.
Only 4?
Only four? Yes, go ahead. If you could name the era of poetry you came into, what would you call
The era. I've gone through 4 or 5 different eras at this point. The era that I came into poetry was during the Vietnam War. The era that I came into was, 2 years after the civil rights movement was taking place, or civil rights became law. So, started from that point, and then later on, the whole era of the war between what is poetry and what is not poetry. What is poetry and what is slam? What is performance? What is this? What is that era? And the era of returning back to roots. I'm still generationally tied to all of the eras in terms of the messages that are coming out in the poetry, which I've tried to change. And what I mean by that is that I've always taught and have written to make some time, to influence people or inspire people to make change and be visionaries. And the whole entire time I was working with the slam poets and teaching in the schools and teaching in various places, I would always listen to the poets. I would listen to what they were saying, and I would always come back with, how do you write your way out of that? And there's a poem that I dedicated to Dudley Randall in the book that I have, Solitude of 5 Black Moons. It's a response to Dudley's, a poet is not a jukebox, so don't tell me what to write. And that covers the time I was teaching in the juvenile facilities. So there's lines in there like, what does bread that hasn't been eaten by rats look like? What is love? What is true love? So it's like, can you, because the themes of trauma are constantly repeated. There's nothing wrong with that. But what I was trying to get across to the poets and the writers is that wherever you go, wherever you read, wherever you spit your poems, you have children sometimes sitting in front of you. And they're, looking up at the stage and they think you're gods and goddesses. And they're hanging on to every word. And after a while, and this is my opinion, that's psychological programming. You can only hear so much trauma and start to believe that this is the only reality that you have. So I've always challenged the poets and the writers and whomever else. How do you get write something into the future? What does, this empty lot with broken glass look like 10 years from now, 5 years from now? It's hard to try and envision things, but at some point, you must ask yourself, when does this stop? You have to, maybe you'll never, but I feel that at some point, you must ask yourself or come to a realization that this trauma has got to stop. How do I fix it? And I inspire the students and encourage the students, just try to get it out first. Because that's the heaviness that's coming out of your soul. And then replace it with something good. Imagine it, and that's one thing about being poets and writers, and musicians and artists. We're constantly bombarded with so much negative stuff and outside stuff that we have to really be in check with ourselves. I have another poem that's called Checkpoints. One of the lines in it is, checkpoints are found in reflection in the mirror. And this deals with, perceptions and judgments of people. Why can't we sit in a room and just have a conversation, a peaceful conversation? Why do you have to, how do we get to the root of why we hate and dislike one another? But you have to go real deep inside for that. And as writers, we're constantly struggling, how to, and many folks, in Detroit, it's been documented. Many of us have post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay? So we have to be able to, if we can't do it ourselves, find that support group. In the writing world, we had that at one time. I don't know if that's still happening because I haven't been out here. But many people are suffering alone. So whomever is watching this, I would hope that you'll be able to try to take a few minutes to imagine what a better future will look like, a relationship would look like, a neighborhood would look like, what love really is. Because you can't go out here and love people if you don't love yourself. And I've always said, as community workers, who's going to heal the healer if the healer gets sick? Right? So that applies, in my opinion, to everything that we're creating if we're calling ourselves these, holistic healing people,
To kind of piggyback off of current question, this next question, if you want to add anything, where do you think Detroit poetry will be in the next 10 years? What do you hope for?
That's an interesting question. I'm hoping that the poets will continue to tell the truth. With technology, for those of the creatives who are using it, I think that there will be some AI enhancements that, in terms of artistic stuff, but the writing, I'm hoping that the writing will still come from the person and not from AI generated work. I'm hoping that there'll be more venues opening up, that people will continue to write the truth and document it, document their experiences and experiences around them. as part of the record. Because see, we have to advance. We're in the state right now where, we're our backs, many of us are up against the wall. We're walking around with, we could be possibly stopped, detained, have your papers on you. We should be writing about that. We should be addressing that, especially when they're taking people. It doesn't matter at this point if you're black, brown, white, Asian, whatever. They're taking everybody. So we need to be writing about that. We need to be going back and looking at Nazi Germany and whatever. And in my opinion, you don't have to, but for the younger folk, you need to understand the history and then and what is happening now. And we need to write about that, because what I expect in the next 10 years or within the next 4 or 5, all these traumas are going to start coming out, just like they did during World War II, from the victims and the survivors. We've got to find some other ways to get that writing out, because we know, the whole United States could be censored at any moment. So you have to be very, very creative in how you're going to get your work out, because they're monitoring everything. So if your social media is being monitored, your internet, your phone, every time, if I say something, the phone is answering me back. You know what I mean? So you have to be very creative. I'm down with the underground. Mike Banks and them over there, underground resistance. You are. We have to go back into self-determination, figure out our own ways of communication. And I'm talking, from my own background of how I was raised. My father's people started the Nation of Islam. They're some of the founders. So we were very self-determined, figure out how you're going to get out of the space and in order to survive and continue on.
You're speaking to me. I'm like, okay. If you had unlimited resources, time, how would you choose to uplift the Detroit poetry scene?
I would probably go back into what I was doing before, creating venues. Because part of what I did, I had, I'm one of the people who created the Artist Village. And Comerica Java Jazz, the worship service, my own poetry venue. So, and then I also crossed with that, I was also an agent for bands and negotiating contracts and things like that. But if I had unlimited, I would buy a building or 2. And I would make one space a space for children and adults with disabilities, so that my nephew would have, and people such as him, would have a space, a safe space. That's first and foremost. And then all the other venues would come later. I had an opportunity years ago from the state of Michigan to have state support to buy up buildings and refurbish them. But because of the people I would partner with, it fell through. But I did have that chance. I have not let go of that dream. And maybe it'll happen. But that's what I wanted to see. I wanted to see this Detroit be as vibrant as any other place. New York, LA, Atlanta, whatever, where you could go out and you could have safe spaces to write in, safe spaces that you could go every week to hear something different, to get your work out. That's what I would do.
question, kind of. Anything else worth mentioning that you would like to make sure is documented or said?
Understand your worth as a writer. I, at one time, was a co-chair of the diversity committee for the National Writers Union. And part of my job at that time and others was to protect the rights of writers and to teach that, your writing is worth something. So understand your worth. Understand how valuable what you're creating is, not just to yourself, but to the world. I would say, try to stay inspired as you can. Get with other like minds and writers and form, writing groups and keep your spirits up. Try to keep your spirits up. We have a long way to go as a people, as a society. We have so many challenges. But in writing, pick one of them to write about. Don't try to write about everything all at once because it can become overwhelming. But just take that one. And when you write, and I tell the writing students this, when you write something and you don't like it, don't throw it away. Just save it. Because that's the first thing that's coming out of your subconscious, your soul, whatever. Put it aside, come back and look at it in a couple of weeks, because you never know if you could turn that poem or that first writing into several different types of poems, haikus, sonnets, a spoken word piece. There might be a line in that stuff that you think is, trash or garbage. That could be the jewel of a really good piece. Keep your hopes up, keep your head up. And here's another thing. There are 1 billion opinions in the world about writing and your writing or my writing or whatever. And my attitude is, so what? Don't let anybody's criticism stop you from writing. You got to try to develop some thick skin and get outside people who can give you an objective point of view, because all your friends are going to say, oh, it's fabulous. It's wonderful. It's great. But you've got to be able to go outside. There's still some of us, a few of us, that are still here in the city that you can, come and share some work. I mean, I even in between teaching, I still get folks asking me, sending me their stuff to look at or whatever. Don't give up. Never give up. That's it.